In the age when the star altars guttered and the prayers of whole civilizations rose like smoke into a deaf heaven, there drifted at the edge of the sable reach a shrine world called Ione, known once for vineyards of silver grain and basilicas roofed in mirrored bronze. By the time this account begins, its fields were trenches, its rivers were channels of blackened runoff, and its sacred towers rang not with hymns but with impact alarms and the cough of artillery that had not ceased in 7 unbroken years. Above it hung a red sun in visible decline, immense and sickly, shedding a light like blood diluted in water. The priests said the star itself was dying for mankind's sins. The general said it made no difference so long as the shell found its mark. Across that wounded heaven there came, without heraldry or escort, a vessel so plain that the sentry arrays did not at first believe it worthy of record. It had no chapel spires, no shrieking prows, no saintly reliquaries chained to its hull. It resembled a coffin cast in dull metal and forgotten by its makers. It entered the atmosphere through curtains of ash, took the judgment of flak batteries without returning fire, and descended in a slow, ungainly fall toward the northern continent, where the city shrine of Val Turris had been under encirclement for 319 days. In the final hours before its landing, millions were already at prayer. Val Turris stood upon a plateau of obsidian bedrock, and its walls had once been white enough to wound the eye. Then the siege had come. The outer curtain had become a necklace of breaches. The plazas were layered with rubble, devotional banners, broken armor, frozen blood, and the dead who could not be buried because the cemeteries were craters, and the mourners had long ago become defenders. Within the city, the last procession of the Ashen Litany was making its circuit around the inner sanctum, priests barefoot upon shattered stone, censers swinging, mouths crusted with dust and scripture. In the underways, children loaded shells into the lifts. At the battlements, widows in flak cloaks pressed old rifles to their shoulders and waited for the next assault horn. Beyond the walls, in trenches braided for miles across the plain, the besieging armies assembled beneath standards made from skin, brass, and scripture defaced into blasphemy. Their war engines were cathedrals on tracks, each bearing guns large as civic monuments. Their champions walked among them in iron shells engraved with curses. Behind all this, half seen through the fumes, rose an idol of impossible scale being built from scavenged guns, shattered saints, and the bones of the fallen. It was said that when the idol opened its mouth, the city's faith would die. When the plain vessel touched ground, no one noticed at first. It came down beyond a field of wrecked transports, on the lip of a crater filled with rust-colored water. Its hatch opened with a sigh so ordinary it seemed an insult to the age. From within stepped a man of unremarkable stature and almost offensively simple appearance. He wore a plain mantle the color of old parchment over a close-fitting suit without sigils or honors. His boots sank a little into the mud. His face was calm, almost vacant, as if he had emerged from sleep and expected to find a quieter world awaiting him. He looked about him. Around the crater lay corpses in every direction, some new, some so old that armor and bone had become one substance beneath the rain. Far off, the guns pounded with such force that the earth trembled like a beast dreaming of its own slaughter. Overhead, the red sun stared down through poison cloud. The pilgrim turned his head toward the sound of battle, and though no expression of horror crossed his features, he began at once to walk. There were witnesses to his road. A squad of trench scouts from the besiegers saw him pass through a minefield without misstep, not because he avoided the mines but because those that lay beneath his feet failed to erupt, as if even the detonators hesitated. 2 feral dogs followed him for a time and then fled whining when he crossed the shadow of a wrecked gunship. A dying sergeant, propped against a broken wheel, saw the man pause beside him and offer a canteen. The sergeant drank, wept, and tried to ask what regiment he served. The stranger did not answer. His gaze had already lifted to the city ahead, where smoke climbed in black pillars from the breach lines. By dusk the assault began. The attackers rolled forward under the cover of organ guns and bombardment, ranks swallowed and reformed within curtains of dust. Bells tolled from Val Turris, searchlights lanced the haze. The first wave reached the broken outer wall and vanished into fire. The second wave came over their bodies. Then came the mailed giants, wielding chain-bladed halberds and shields nailed with relic bones. Above them loomed a siege engine shaped like a kneeling martyr, its shoulders opening to reveal missile tubes packed with phosphor warheads. On the wall called Maiden's Rest, where defenders already numbered the living by handfuls, Canoness Elira Vale watched the engine advance. She had one eye left, 3 cartridges for her pistol, and enough faith to curse the stars. When the martyr engine fired, she thought it was the end of the district. The missiles rose with white tails, hung in the bloodlight of the dying sun, and began their descent toward the packed sanctums beyond the wall. Then, the plain-faced stranger stepped into view. He had crossed the killing ground unnoticed, though no living historian later agreed on how. One moment the breach line was ruin and shrieking metal. The next, he stood atop a mound of fallen masonry before the engine, his cape snapping once in the furnace wind. The nearest attackers hesitated, puzzled by the sheer irreverence of his appearance. No armor seal, no war mask, no relics, no fear. The martyr engine turned its upper body with a groan of gears and lowered its cathedral-sized hammer arm toward him. Vox amplifiers boomed a sentence of condemnation that was lost in the thunder. The pilgrim drew back one hand. He did not invoke a god. He did not utter an oath. He did not assume the poise of a duelist or the ecstasy of a fanatic. He merely struck. What followed entered the annals in contradictory language because no witness possessed words equal to it. Some said there was a flash, though none saw light. Some said the sound came after, though the wall shook before any thunder reached it. The engine ceased to exist from the point of impact backward, not exploded but abolished, converted in an instant into a storm of red metal, boiling oil, atomized bone, and fragments so fine they rattled across the stones like rain. Behind it, the assault front opened in a widening corridor of devastation. Men, guns, standards, and armored carriers were thrown aside as if a giant hand had swept the earth clean. The blast trench ran for miles, smoking under the dim sun, until it vanished into the horizon haze. For one impossible breath, the battlefield fell silent. On Maiden's Rest, Elira Vale forgot her pain. In the trenches, blasphemers dropped their weapons and stared. In the city's inner sanctum, thousands at prayer raised their heads at once, for the ground itself had spoken in a language older than doctrine. The pilgrim lowered his fist and looked into the distance where the line had been. There was no triumph in him, no wrath spent, no revelation, only the same grave stillness with which he had stepped from his vessel. He seemed, if anything, faintly disappointed, as though he had expected the act to accomplish more than it had. And indeed, it had not ended the war. From the far side of the smoking gap there began to rise another sound. Not gunfire, not command horns, but a chant carried over miles of ruin by 100,000 voices finding unity in terror. Upon the unfinished idol beyond the trenches, eyes of furnace glass opened one by one in the deepening dusk. Within the city, bells that had rung for deliverance now rang for judgment, because no one could say whether the thing that had arrived beneath the dying sun had come to save Ione, or to teach it how small salvation truly was. News did not travel swiftly across the Empire of Man. It bled. It passed from shrine world vox towers through astropathic choirs chained to bronze thrones, through the mouths of the blind and the burnt, through relays of sanctified code and fever script. By the time the account of Val Turris reached the central dominions, it had already been clothed in contradiction. One transmission called the stranger a living saint who had smitten an army with the gesture of a judge dismissing a petitioner. Another named him a breach in natural law, a void-born instrument sent to test mankind's obedience. A third, intercepted and sealed beneath 7 sigils, suggested with trembling caution that no soul signature had been detected where one should have burned brighter than a star. Thus the first whisper of him entered the hall of the veiled conclave on distant sarcophages, where the Empire's rulers wore authority like funeral armor and spoke beneath statues blackened by centuries of votive smoke. The hall had been carved inside a mountain older than the species that now infested its flanks with fortress cities. Its ceiling was invisible in shadow. Its pillars were sheathed in iron plaques, engraved with the names of those worlds condemned, redeemed, tithed to extinction, or erased from memory by decree. At the far end, upon ascending terraces of basalt and ash, stood the representation of imperial sovereignty, not the true seat of ultimate power, which remained inaccessible to all but myth and machinery, but a lesser throne from which judgments were issued in its name. It was built from fused weapons, funeral urns, and the rib bones of colossal beasts taken from dead moons. It had no comfort in it. It was not made for a body. It was made for obedience. Before that throne, the message from Ione was recited aloud. The first to speak against it was Inquisitor Malrek Voss, whose face had long ago been cut into planes of severity by burns and surgery. He stood in a coat lined with purity seals written upon human skin, one gloved hand resting on the pommel of a narrow execution blade. He listened without visible change, yet inwardly his thought moved like a machine of knives. He had seen cults rise from lesser wonders. He had seen whole sectors ignited by a single rumor of divine intervention. If a man existed who could erase engines and armies with one strike, then truth was secondary. Meaning would be the more lethal force. Beside him, Magister Prelate Oren Thale of the Red Basilica made the sign of the 9 wounds and lowered his hood. Tubes ran from the folds of his throat into the reliquary engine upon his back, where a preserved choir child sang faintly in narcotic sleep. "A sign has been granted," he declared. "When heaven grows silent, it speaks in catastrophe. The world of Ione has been judged worthy of visitation." At this, the chamber stirred with discomfort. Among the Empire's priesthood there were always some who desired miracles, and others who feared them more than invasion. Both knew that the sudden arrival of wonder within a decaying order could unmake hierarchies built over millennia. Miracles, if uncontrolled, turned institutions into kindling. Archdominus Sirach of the Mechanum Synod requested permission to examine the recovered telemetry. He did not look at the others as he spoke. Most of his skull had been replaced by polished augmetics etched with liturgical ciphers, and where his eyes should have been there shone 2 lenses of dark sapphire rotating in precise increments. Around him clung the cold incense of machine sanctums. "The matter concerns aberrant force expression," he said. "Either a weapon unknown to current taxonomies has manifested, or an existing taxonomy is incomplete. Both outcomes require acquisition." "Acquisition," Malrek Voss repeated, as though tasting something spoiled. "Everything to your order becomes acquisition. Everything to yours becomes guilt," Sirach answered. Neither man raised his voice. None did in that hall. It was a place where tone mattered less than sanction, and sanction always descended from above. At length the decision was rendered by the throne speaker, an ancient official whose body was mostly hidden within ceremonial life support apparatus shaped like mourning drapery cast in bronze. His words emerged through layered vox grills, stripped of any trace of age or weakness. The Empire, he said, could not permit a new symbol to wander unmeasured through a time already overfilled with omens. Therefore, a triune mandate would be issued. First, the Inquisition would travel to Ione and determine whether the stranger constituted contamination, deviation, or strategic necessity. Second, the priesthood would prepare doctrinal containment should the masses attempt to elevate him into unsanctioned sainthood. Third, a force of gene-forged executioners would accompany both, not as envoys but as the final instrument of correction if all lesser judgments failed. At that decree, the doors of the hall opened. They entered without fanfare, 7 warriors from the Order of the Gilded Sepulchre, towering figures in armor the color of old funerary gold. Their height was unnatural, their silence more so. They were bred from the Empire's most guarded vault sciences, their bones laced with miracle metals, their organs redundant, Their reflexes sharpened beyond ordinary humanity into something colder and more exact. Each bore a long-bladed glaive and a bolt-caster large enough to break lesser men at the shoulder. Their helmets resembled death masks taken from forgotten kings. Among the assembled lords and priests, only the Mechanum delegates did not avert their gaze. These executioners were not deployed for diplomacy. Their presence transformed discussion into prelude. The leader of the seven removed his helmet. He was called a Castian Rain, and his face was pale, austere, and almost beautiful in the manner of statues made to honor conquest rather than life. A scar crossed one eye, though no record agreed on what weapon could have placed it there. He listened as the mandate was spoken and accepted it with the slightest inclination of the head. Yet even in that obedience there moved an unease he would not name. For he too had read the testimonies from Ione. He had studied battlefield renderings, crater topographies, the broken logic of impact calculations. The force required to produce such devastation from a single biological limb was beyond reason, beyond doctrine, almost beyond war itself. There existed weapons that could scorch cities, relics that could fold matter inward, engines that devoured armies by the thousand. But these belonged to categories men could store, fear, worship, or destroy. This stranger did not. He was a man, by all visible proportion. That was the offense. Preparations began before the embers in the hall's censers had settled. Inquisition cutters were loaded with cipher chests and torture reliquaries. Priests of the Red Basilica composed provisional litanies in which the stranger might be named servant, mask, or temptation depending on later need. In the forged cathedrals below the mountain, thralls polished the armor of the gilded sepulchre until it shone like the lids of sealed tombs. Astropaths were flayed into trance to secure the route through the warplanes. Sacrificial doves were burned over engine cores. 3 navigators went blind, charting the least perilous passage. One died screaming a name no scribe could preserve. Far away, on Ione, the war had resumed. The gap torn in the besiegers' lines had become an object of dread. Neither side entered it willingly. Men assigned to recover bodies their return changed, their speech slowed, their eyes fixed on the horizon, as if awaiting a second blow to finish some invisible sentence. Around the stranger, rumor multiplied faster than command could contain it. Some said he did not sleep. Some said bullets turned aside from him out of shame. Some said he had asked, in a voice almost gentle, why there were so many people trying to kill one another when it seemed such a tiring arrangement. No one agreed on what he wanted. He moved through the ruins without escort, pausing only to look upon collapsed sanctums, food lines, the wounded laid in corridors between prayer wheels and shell racks. He did not preach. He did not bless. He stared at suffering as though measuring it against an expectation he had not been told to abandon. In his wake, arguments broke out among the clergy. Was he a gift sent to preserve the city? A punishment for needing such a gift? A thing without place in any theology and therefore intolerable? On the 4th night after the first blow, Canoness Elira Vale found him standing atop the highest broken tower of Val Turris, looking not at the enemy camps but upward, toward the dying red sun. Its light had grown dimmer still. Great bands of shadow moved across its face, though no moon crossed there. The air tasted of iron and storm rot. Even the artillery had fallen to a troubled hush, as if both armies sensed that something vast was drawing near through layers of heaven not meant to open. Elira climbed the broken stair behind him and asked, with the solemnity of one who feared the answer, whether he had come to save the city. The plain-faced pilgrim did not turn. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a weariness so human it was almost more dreadful than his strength, he replied that he had thought ending one battle might help. Below them, in the dark beyond the trenches, furnace eyes opened again in the unfinished idol of the enemy host. And above, where the red star was dying, a rent of pale fire began to form across the sky, as though the heavens themselves had been scored by a hidden blade whose stroke had not yet fallen. The wound he had cut through the battlefield did not heal. It remained from horizon to horizon, a scar of vaporized earth and fused iron where the plane had been translated into another substance by force too complete for ordinary destruction. Men gave it names according to their loyalties. The defenders of Val Turris called it the Mercy Road, believing for a little while that heaven had laid open a path through which deliverance might yet arrive. The besiegers called it the Judgment Furrow, and would not cross it except under lash and litany. The dead, had they spoken, might have named it more truthfully than either side, the place where meaning had been shattered before matter. Yet the war endured on both sides of that impossible trench. No victory in that age came alone. It dragged consequence behind it as a chain drags bones. Within the city, the common folk who had survived the long siege emerged from crypts, cisterns, and chapel basements to look upon the broken enemy line. They stood in doorways with soot upon their faces and the light of sick wonder in their eyes. Mothers lifted children to the shattered parapet so they could say, in later years, if later years were granted, that they had seen the hour when the sky answered. Old veterans knelt before the stranger when he passed and pressed their scarred foreheads to the rubble at his feet. The priests, who had long instructed the people to expect miracles only through recognized forms, now found themselves forced into improvisations of doctrine, searching old books for precedents that did not exist and discovering only silence. Canoness Illyra Vale watched this growth of reverence with increasing dread. She had fought too long to trust what men loved quickly. Faith under siege did not become purer. It became hungry. Give it a sign and it demanded a theology to cage it. Give it a savior, and it at once sharpened the knives by which saviors were eventually dissected. She knew the temper of Val Turris. It was a city that could carry relics through bombardment without dropping the hymn, but it was also a city that had burned reformers alive for errors of phrasing while alien shells burst over the procession route. The wanderer understood none of this machinery of devotion, though he began dimly to sense its suffocating movement around him. He walked the streets in the same plain mantle, pausing where the wounded were gathered beneath hanging lamps of rendered fat, or where laborers pulled stone from collapsed arches with bleeding hands. He asked simple questions. Where was food kept? Why were these children working the shell hoists? Why did the hospitals separate men by rank when all of them seemed equally close to death? Those who heard him often mistook the plainness of his speech for hidden profundity. But it was plainness only. He had entered a world in which everything was wrapped in ritual, and he could not understand why none of it seemed to make the suffering smaller. At dawn on the sixth day, the city's east quarter burned. The fire began where a phosphor shell had buried itself deep in an archived chapel and awakened hours later amid stores of parchment, oil, and embalming resin. By the time the alarm spread, flame was moving through the district as through a dry forest. The houses there were narrow, the alleys constricted by centuries of additions and devotional annexes. Wind drove sparks from roof to roof, bells pealed, citizens formed bucket lines that broke whenever artillery struck nearby. The defenders on the wall could do little, for the besiegers had begun their bombardment anew, sensing weakness in the city's distraction. From the Tower of Maiden's Rest, Illyra saw the pattern immediately. The enemy meant to divide the city's will, fire within, assault without. If the east quarter fell completely, panic would cut through the sanctum districts faster than any battering ram. She sent runners. She ordered the reserve militias into the lower streets. She called for the final ammunition casks to be dragged from the reliquary vaults, and because she had no other weapon equal to the hour, she sent for the stranger. He came without haste, stepping through smoke with the same disquieting calm. Around him men coughed blood into cloth and prayed half-finished prayers. Illyra pointed beyond the walls, where new columns of armor rolled forward to support a renewed breach assault. Above them, hanging from chains between siege towers, swung censers the size of barges, vomiting narcotic incense toward the battlements. The defenders had no strength for another full engagement. The east quarter was collapsing. The city, if saved at all, would be saved by swiftness beyond ordinary war. "Can you stop them?" Illyra asked. He looked from the burning district to the advancing line. In another life, in another order of being, the question might have been absurd. Here it sounded like the final petition of a civilization too exhausted to blush before impossibility. "I can stop them," he said. Then he was gone from the tower. Those who witnessed what followed preserved it in fresco, song, and interrogation transcript, though no record captured it whole. He crossed the wall in a single bound and landed amidst the foremost armor ranks with a force that drove vehicles onto their sides, as though they were toys cast from a child's hand. He tore the cannon from a siege carriage and flung it end over end through two advancing transports. He struck the earth before a phalanx of mailed giants, and the shockwave folded them backward in a rippling collapse of shattered plate and imploded organs. Wherever he moved, the line ceased to be a line. It became debris, smoke, and screaming gaps. The defenders on the wall saw this and exulted. Their fear broke into frenzy. Command dissolved under the weight of hope. Militias that should have held reserve positions poured out through the shattered gates, chasing the retreating enemy into the open ground. Priests led them with relic spears raised high, shouting that the day of reversal had come at last. Bells thundered from every surviving tower. In the East Quarter, citizens abandoned the bucket lines and flood trenches to climb the roofs and witness what they believed was the turning of the age. And so the deeper ruin entered. The unfinished idol beyond the besiegers' camps was no idol at all, but a vessel of convergence. Its mass had been assembled not merely from salvage and desecration, but according to geometries stolen from older wars and older species. Its furnace eyes had not opened in response to fear alone. They had been waiting for sufficient concentration of faith, terror, triumph, and bloodshed to awaken the mechanism sleeping inside its carcass. The stranger's second intervention, so absolute and so public, gave the battlefield exactly what the vessel required: unanimous attention, emotion sharpened into worship and horror alike, and the collapse of all remaining boundaries between devotion and slaughter. As the defenders surged from the gates, the idol split along hidden seams. Its chest unfolded like the petals of a grave flower. From within rose no machine spirit, but a vertical wound in reality itself, pale at the edges and black in its depth. Wind blew inward toward it. Ash, bodies, banners, and prayers were drawn across the plain. Those nearest the opening did not fall immediately. Some were suspended in the air, as if caught in amber, their faces transformed not by pain but by revelation too vast for flesh. Then they were gone. The chant that rose from the enemy host changed its register. It ceased to be human song and became a resonance heard equally in the bones, in the teeth, and in the half-remembered fears of childhood. On the walls of Val Turris, jubilation became terror. Militia columns in the open broke apart as the wound in the world widened. Flame from the East Quarter bent sideways in the unnatural wind. Statues along the processional avenues began to weep molten metal from their eyes. In the hospitals, the dying sat upright together and stared eastward, whispering words in languages none of them had learned. The plain-faced wanderer looked upon the opening and, for the first time since his coming to Ione, felt not confusion but resistance in the world itself. Not an enemy of muscle and shell, not an army to be scattered, but a hunger fed by every act meant to oppose it. Above the city, the dying red sun dimmed behind a veil of pale fire. And from within the wound, as if some unseen court had finally taken notice of the man who sought to simplify war, there emerged a hand of shadow vast enough to eclipse a district, reaching not for the city, nor for the armies, but for him alone. The hand descended from the wound in the sky with the deliberation of a sentence long prepared. It was not a true hand, though mortal sight named it so. It possessed the arrangement of fingers, the curvature of a palm, the gesture of seizure, yet each seeming bone was formed from layered darkness through which faces flickered and vanished. Between its knuckles burned dim constellations unknown to human astrologies. Its shadow passed over battlements, trenches, burning streets, and broken engines alike, and where that shadow lingered too long, men remembered griefs that had not yet happened. Some fell to their knees, some clawed at their own eyes, some laughed in voices borrowed from the dead. Only the plain-faced pilgrim beneath it remained untouched by spectacle. He stood upon the torn plain where the defenders' reckless sortie had become a panic of retreat. Around him ran soldiers stripped at once of courage and discipline, casting aside standards to lighten their flight. Priests dropped reliquaries and called upon names that did not answer. The wounded dragged themselves through ash that drifted backward toward the widening breach. Over all of it hung the pale wound in the air, and from that place beyond nature came the pressure of a regard vast enough to humble empires. The hand fell. He struck upward. The collision did not thunder at once. First came a stillness so complete that every flame along the battlefield narrowed and held its shape. Then a ring of force burst outward from the meeting of fist and shadow, flattening trenches, shattering nearby statues into powder, and hurling men from their feet across half the plain. The hand split through the center as glass splits under a hammer, yet what bled from it was not blood but voices, 10,000 of them, crying out in ecstasy, grief, hunger, and praise before being torn into silence by the wind. The severed halves recoiled toward the breach like wounded thoughts. All Val Turris saw. From its towers to its catacombs, from the noble vaults to the shell-flooded alleys, the city beheld a man stand against a gesture of the abyss and deny it with one human movement. There are instances in history when an entire people chooses belief not because reason submits, but because terror demands shape. Such an instant came then to the city that had prayed through fire. The bells changed their meaning. They no longer rang for alarm, nor for the hourly devotions of the old liturgy. They rang in broken, ecstatic sequences as clergy argued atop the towers, each striving to sanctify the event before another faction claimed it first. Some cried that a new intercessor had been sent in the empire's darkest hour. Others declared that no servant of heaven would dress in such unadorned humility, unless humility itself were the sign. Others still denounced the entire phenomenon as the most cunning temptation ever permitted to test the faithful. Yet even those who condemned him could not keep their eyes from the plain. Canoness Elira Vale understood before most that something irreversible had happened. The city had not been saved. The breach in reality still hung above the battlefield, withdrawing and dilating like an eye half opened in sleep. Fires still spread in the east quarter. The enemy host, though staggered, had not broken. But the inner balance by which Val Turris had endured its suffering was gone. A people can survive hunger, bombardment, and plague if their explanation of the world remains intact. Let that explanation fracture, and even deliverance becomes a weapon. By nightfall the first procession had formed. It began among the Hab workers and widow militias of the lower sanctum district, where relief had always worn the face of rumor before it wore the face of bread. They gathered in silence at first, then in chant, each carrying a strip of crimson cloth torn from battle banners, altar veils, officers' sashes, or the garments of the newly dead. These cloths they bound about their arms, their brows, their rifles, and the wrists of their children. They marched barefoot through streets littered with shell glass, following no priestly command and asking none. At their head they carried not an icon sculpted in gold, but an empty circle of iron taken from the shattered wheel of a gun carriage to signify, some said, the plain perfection of the blow that had cast down the darkness. They called themselves the Red Saints. No canon had authorized the name. That did not matter. Names born from desperate multitudes acquire legitimacy by accumulation. The procession wound through the inner districts beneath smoke and bell song, chanting that the age of intermediaries had ended, that heaven had remembered the shape of man, that the unadorned stranger had come to strike open the prison of war. The clergy recoiled in alarm. Here was unsanctioned doctrine, populist ecstasy, sanctity seized from below rather than bestowed from above. The high confessors ordered the processions dispersed, but soldiery sent to scatter them often removed their helmets instead and joined the march. A relic warden denounced the Red Saints from a balcony and was answered not with stones but with silence so cold that he fled under guard before night's end. Beyond the walls, the contagion of meaning spread in another form. The enemy host had witnessed the sundered hand no less clearly than the city. Among them, too, interpretation became fever. Their champions declared that the wanderer was no savior but an affront to the sacred economy of suffering, a thief who sought to interrupt the ordained exchange of blood by which power was purchased from the unseen. Where the blast of his upward strike had scattered bodies into impossible patterns, the enemy began to raise crude shrines of twisted metal and severed limbs. Their war priests knelt before the craters and dipped their hands into the ash, anointing their brows with the remains of those annihilated by his force. To them, the dead blasted apart by the stranger had become martyrs of negation, witnesses to a presence too empty to comprehend and therefore worthy of cosmic hatred. Thus did both sides begin to worship the same event in opposing languages. The city's red saints saw a plain redeemer who cut through falsehood by sheer simplicity of will. The besiegers saw a blasphemy against holy torment, a void-handed destroyer whose existence must be answered by more exalted cruelty. Between these devotions stood the man himself, wholly alien to both. When at last he returned within the walls, he did so not as conqueror but as one more exhausted soul, entering a refuge that no longer knew how to receive him. The crowds parted before him, then pressed inward again, kneeling, reaching, weeping, calling him by titles he did not recognize. Some held up infants for blessing. Some begged him to end the siege, the empire, the stars, their grief, their hunger. One old woman merely touched the hem of his mantle and thanked him for making the sky afraid. He looked at them with growing bewilderment. He had struck because something terrible was reaching down to take him, and because countless others would have been broken beneath it. That was all. Yet here, in this diseased civilization, even the simplest act became scripture once enough blood had dried around it. He saw in their uplifted faces not peace but appetite. They wished not merely to be saved, but to have their centuries of anguish justified by the form salvation chose. Canoness Elira found him at the threshold of the inner basilica, while the red saints passed below in rivers of crimson cloth and candle smoke. She told him, with the tired honesty of one who had outlived most illusions, that he must leave the city before its love destroyed more than its enemies ever could. He turned toward her, and for a moment the noise of the processions seemed to recede. Beyond the walls, the pale wound still bled light into the night. Far above it, shapes vast and indistinct moved behind the stars like thoughts not yet admitted into waking. Before he could answer, the first of the Imperial ships entered orbit. Their descent engines burned through the cloud layers like judgment made visible, and every soul in Valturis understood at once that the city had not summoned rescue, but scrutiny. The ships that descended upon Ione did not come like saviors. They came like verdicts. Their hulls were black against the dying sun, ribbed with cathedral buttresses and plated in armor older than many nations. Flame poured from their engines in columns so vast that whole districts of cloud were burned away, exposing the sick red light above and the scarred world below in equal nakedness. Sirens moaned through Valturis. The red saints fell to their knees in the streets, believing at first that heaven had sent confirmation of their new devotion. The older clergy bowed their heads for another reason. They knew the shape of imperial scrutiny. It never arrived merely to witness. Landing fields were improvised from cemeteries, plazas, and the shattered courtyards of once sacred libraries. From the first craft came inquisitorial retinues in ash-gray coats, their banners hanging still despite the rotor wash, as though even the wind had been instructed not to touch them. From the second emerged the priests of the machine's sanctums, robed in dark red and brass, cables swaying from their spines like metallic entrails. Servo skulls circled them in silent orbits, bearing censers, lenses, bone saws, and censuses of sin. From the third descended the 7 warriors of the gilded sepulchre, gold-armored and unhurried, each footfall sounding like a tomb being sealed. The city watched from behind broken arches and fire-scorched colonnades. No trumpet announced relief, no munitions convoys followed. The siege still burned beyond the walls, and the pale wound in the sky still pulsed faintly over the plain. Yet the first commands issued by the newcomers concerned not the enemy host, nor the breach in reality, but the stranger. Find him. Isolate him. Bring him intact if possible. Inquisitor Malrek Voss made his way through the inner basilica without escort, for escort would have implied vulnerability. His boots clicked over mosaics half buried by dust and shattered glass. He passed priests who would not meet his gaze, wounded soldiers too disciplined to speak, and processional candles burned down into wax puddles red as opened flesh. At the high transept he found Canoness Elira Vale waiting beside a cracked statue whose saintly face had been taken off by artillery years before. They regarded one another with the exhausted hostility of those who recognized their kinship in service and despised it. "You have brought judges," Elira said. "I have brought containment," Malrek answered. "He saved your world's tithes from annihilation. He may yet prove more costly than their loss." Elira might have argued further, but she knew the arithmetic of empire. Deeds did not purchase trust. They merely raised the value of betrayal should it come. She told him where the Wanderer had last been seen, not among the crowds that worshipped him, nor in the towers where the clergy debated his nature, but in the lower infirmaries, helping move stone from a collapsed surgical ward because no one else left living there had strength enough. Malrek went down to him himself. The ward had once been a chapel dedicated to merciful endings. Its saints had lost their faces to heat. Its altar now served as an operating slab. Beneath a broken arch, among bloodied bandages and overturned instruments, the plain-faced pilgrim was lifting masonry away from a pinioned beam while two medicae hauled survivors clear. He looked up as the Inquisitor approached, not with alarm but with the vague patience of a man interrupted in a tedious task. Malrek had prepared many openings for this meeting. None survived first sight. There was no aura around the man, no visible corruption, no radiance, no ceremonial violence of presence. He looked almost offensively ordinary amid so much ruin, and that ordinariness was its own obscenity. The Inquisitor had spent a lifetime discerning danger by excess. Too much charisma, too much hunger, too much certainty, too much fear. This one gave nothing. He resembled a laborer who had wandered into the machinery of myth by accident, and somehow forced it to break around him. "You will come with us," Malrek said. The stranger glanced at the survivors being dragged from beneath the beam. "Will it help?" That answer, simple and sincere, disordered every prepared liturgy of accusation. "It may help us understand what you are." He stood a moment longer, then set aside the broken stone in his hands. "All right," he said. So easily was it done that suspicion deepened at once. Snares were expected, resistance anticipated, miracles feared. Compliance was intolerable. Yet the Wanderer offered none of the drama that would have made him fit within Imperial categories. He merely followed. They took him not to the inquisitorial cutters, nor to the command bastions hastily raised outside the city, but below Val Turris into vaults few living citizens knew still existed. Long before the shrine world had become a fortress, before its silver fields and mirrored basilicas, it had been a station of astronomical devotion, where machine priests watched the heavens and fed equations into engines built when mankind still believed knowledge might redeem it. Those engines had not all died. Some had only fallen silent beneath strata of conquest, doctrine, and neglect. Archdominus Sirac had found the sealed descents within hours of landing. Now the lower vaults awakened to receive their guest. Bronze doors of impossible thickness groaned aside. Galleries lit by cold lumen rods stretched beneath the city like the ribs of a buried leviathan. There stood machines large as cathedrals, sheathed in dust and prayer cloth, their surfaces engraved with stellar maps, surgical formulae, and hymns in dead mathematical tongues. Suspended from chains were embalmed savants whose preserved hands still touched key arrays. In glass cylinders floated brains linked to astrolabes. Copper pipes carried black coolant through the gloom with the sound of distant breathing. The priests of the machine sanctum moved among these relics as mourners move through ancestral tombs. The Wanderer was led to a circular chamber ringed by 12 upright engines resembling enormous blind faces. Their mouths were speaker grills sealed with wax sigils. Their foreheads bore sockets for data nails thick as stakes. At the center stood an examination dais of stone and steel. Incense rose in linear columns from brass braziers. Bone-white mechadendrites unfolded from the ceiling, each tipped with instruments so refined they scarcely seemed made for flesh. Serac approached the stranger with ritual gravity. "You will submit to quantification." The wanderer looked at the tools descending around him. "Is this going to take long?" No one answered. The question was treated as either insult or incomprehension. They began with scans, blood extraction, tissue samples, ocular mapping, neurometric readings, soul pressure assays performed by chained psychers behind leaded glass. Each result confounded the last. Bone density beyond predictive tolerance. Musculature insufficient by all known models to explain his demonstrated force. Cellular vitality stable beyond natural variance. Psychic nullity absent, yet no measurable resonance equivalent to ordinary human presence. He was not empty, but unreadable, as though every device placed against him received back a refusal not of aggression, but of relevance. Serac ordered deeper penetration. Data nails were driven into ancient ports. The 12 blind-faced engines shuddered. Coolant surged. Dust cascaded from high rafters. One by one the wax seals over the speaker grills split and fell away. For centuries those machines had slept in doctrinal darkness, consulted only for star tides, navigational omen work, and the correction of sacred calendars. Their oldest memory strata predated the current empire's language. Few among the living believed they retained anything like thought. Yet as power flooded their cores and the stranger stood silent at the chamber's center, the engines stirred with something older than protocol. The first voice emerged thin, as wind through crypt stone. "Query," it said in a tongue that translated itself as it sounded. "Why does the pattern stand upright?" The priests froze. Even Malrek Voss felt cold move through him. Another engine woke. Then another. Their grills glowed dull amber. Across the chamber, forgotten displays flickered to life with constellations long erased from modern charts. "Variance impossible," said a second voice. "Recognition partial," whispered a third. Then the largest of the blind faces opened its speaker more, and spoke not to the priests, nor to the inquisitor, but to the plain-faced pilgrim on the dais. "Where?" it asked, with the terrible tremor of something remembering a god it had been forbidden to name, "have you been since the first light abandoned the forge of heaven?" And in the silence that followed, far above them through miles of stone and shrine and war, the pale wound over Ione widened once more. The old machines did not speak again at once. Their question lingered in the circular chamber like a tolling too vast for sound, while those present endured that rarest of imperial humiliations, uncertainty unsoftened by ritual. Archdominus Serac stood motionless beneath the amber glow of the awakened engines, mechadendrites half raised as if even his augmented body had forgotten how to proceed. Inquisitor Malrek Voss, who had looked upon confession pits, witch burnings, and the collapse of 3 subsectors without surrendering his composure, felt the slow intrusion of a thought he had spent his life executing in others. If the oldest minds men still possessed had mistaken this quiet stranger for something remembered from before doctrine, then the matter was no longer one of heresy alone. It had become historical blasphemy, which was worse. The plain-faced pilgrim merely looked up at the machine that had addressed him. "I do not know what you mean," he said. There was no deceit in him. The engines, fed on old languages and stellar records, may have known that. Or perhaps their awakening had already drawn too much notice from realms where knowledge itself was a wound. For before any answer could come, the vault trembled. It began as a soft shiver through the stone beneath their feet. Then the bronze doors groaned inward. Dust rose from rafters in long descending veils. The lumen rods flickered from cold white to a bruised violet. Far above the hidden chamber, the city bells started ringing without human hands upon them. The wound in the sky had widened. Its influence entered the buried sanctum not as light but as pressure, as if another world had leaned itself against the skin of reality and found it thin. One of the chained psychers behind leaded glass began to scream. Another clawed at his restraints until the bones of his wrists showed white through the flesh. Across the chamber displays filled with impossible floral geometries, black blossoms unfolding in recursive patterns over the old star charts. Every screen showed growth. Every pattern described invasion. Sirach hissed an order, and servo-thralls rushed to seal the engines. Too late. The largest blind-faced machine spoke once more, its voice now filled with static like burning leaves. The outer orchard enters bloom. Then its speaker grill burst outward in a shower of sparks and sacred wax. The first thing to come through was a scent. Not rot, nor sulfur, nor any of the predictable perfumes with which men armed themselves against terror. It was the smell of rain upon summer earth, of orchards after pruning, of distant fields under noon light. It struck those in the chamber with such unbearable remembrance that several fell to their knees weeping before they knew why. It was the odor of a peace almost no one present had truly known, and because it came in that place, beneath a city of wounds and under a sky torn open by war, it carried a cruelty deeper than any stench of corruption. Then the walls began to flower. From cracks in the stone emerged pale stems slick as veins, pushing through masonry with slow and unstoppable grace. Their leaves were made of translucent membrane, and within each leaf faint images moved: battlefields, coronations, funerals, harvests, lovers parting under station lamps, mothers lowering infants into ash caskets, all the tender or terrible moments by which mortals taught themselves to endure. Blossoms unfolded next, great white cups dusted with black pollen. At the center of each flower there trembled an eye. The priests recoiled. Mechadendrites slashed at the growth, only to have it curl lovingly around the blades. One executioner of the gilded sepulchre stepped forward and severed an entire mass of stems with his glaive. Where they fell, new shoots rose immediately from the severed ends, blooming faster than blood spreads through water. Malrek Voss drew his narrow execution blade, though he knew steel was now an argument rather than a solution. The stranger did the opposite. He looked upward, toward the layers of stone above the vault, as though he could feel the breach itself and all that spilled from it. The city was in danger again. That much was simple. Simplicity in him was always a form of mercy toward thought. He bent his knees and leapt. The force of his ascent shattered the examination days, cracked the floor, and sent braziers cartwheeling. He drove through the vault ceiling in an eruption of stone and broken iron, through stairwells, reliquary chambers, ossuaries, and sealed prayer galleries, rising in a single continuous act until he emerged into the open night above Val Turris. The city had changed while they spoke below. The pale wound over the plain no longer resembled a tear. It had become an opening broad and curved, like the parted lips of heaven revealing another climate beyond. From it drifted luminous spores, white as ash in moonlight. Wherever they fell, growth followed. The battlements sprouted vines from gun emplacements. Burned plazas softened beneath carpets of dark moss. Along the breach lines, helmets filled with lilies. Corpses rooted into the ground and rose half upright, their mouths spilling garlands instead of blood. The fire in the east quarter still burned, but between the houses there now stood orchards that had not existed an hour before, heavy with fruit the color of bruises. Worse than the sight was the effect. Men on both sides of the siege ceased fighting to walk into that impossible bloom. Some smiled as they went, hearing forgotten songs. Some laid down rifles and embraced strangers whose uniforms should have made them enemies. Others wandered into the flowering streets, calling the names of their dead, for among the leaves and stems faces appeared not true faces, but approximations grown from longing. The city that had survived bombardment and famine now risked dissolving into yearning. The pilgrim crossed the rooftops and reached the plain in moments. Ahead, at the heart of the widening aperture, the world had begun to fold inward like cloth drawn through a ring. He did not hesitate. If the horror came from beyond, then beyond was where he would go. He entered the breach as a man steps through rain. There was no passage in any human sense, only dislocation. One instant war, the next a silence so immense it seemed to have weather in it. He stood upon black soil beneath a sky of pearl-grey light. Before him stretched a garden of limitless extent. Its paths were made of vertebrae polished to ivory brightness. Its hedges were clipped into the forms of kneeling armies. Trees rose in ordered ranks, their bark composed of layered script in languages born and dead, each leaf a thin plate of translucent memory. Rivers moved without sound between flower beds where helmets bloomed like roses and swords bent themselves into trellises. In the distance stood pavilions of flesh-pale stone, and around them moved figures too graceful to be human and too deliberate to be beasts. Everywhere there was cultivation, not chaos, but design. War, here, had not been spilled, it had been planted. He took a step, and the soil beneath his boot sighed with countless voices. From behind the nearest arbor emerged a gardener. It wore the shape of a tall woman draped in white veils, though beneath the veils moved other anatomies, jointed limbs, folded wings, an arrangement of mouths opening and closing in floral patterns along the throat. In one hand it carried a pruning hook of moon-black metal. In the other it held a basket filled with human hearts, each still beating softly in time with the wind through the leaves. It regarded the stranger with neither hatred nor fear, but with the mild appraisal one reserves for a rare blight discovered in a sacred bed. Then it spoke, and its voice was the same scent that had entered the vault below, the fragrance of lost peace given language. "You break what blooms," it said. "Will you strike here as well, where all your wars are only flowers learning their names?" And from deeper in the garden, beyond the hedges shaped like supplicant hosts, there began to ring the laughter of things that had already decided he could not leave unchanged. In the garden beyond the veil, no wind moved that had ever touched a mortal sea. The air possessed a stillness cultivated rather than natural, the stillness of a place where every living thing had been taught its posture in relation to pain. The black soil gave gently beneath the pilgrim's feet, not with the softness of loam, but with the yielding resistance of layered vellum soaked through in ancient oils. Beneath the surface there were shapes. He felt them shift when he stepped, as if roots and bones had entered into one long agreement. The veiled gardener waited upon the path of vertebrae, basket of human hearts hanging from one pale hand. Each heart beat with its own rhythm. Some fluttered like frightened birds. Some labored slowly, burdened by old age. One seemed almost still, as if it had been taken from a person who had died without realizing death had begun. The stranger looked past the gardener into the ordered distances. There were pavilions among the hedges where figures reclined on couches woven from rib and silver vine. There were pools in whose still surfaces other skies turned slowly, each showing a different battlefield at a different hour of ruin. There were trees bearing fruit shaped like helmets, and when one split open of its own ripeness, those nearby could hear from within it the brief and terrible cry of a man recognizing too late the meaning of the wound in his side. Everywhere were signs that this place did not merely reflect war, it harvested from it. "I am trying to stop people from dying," the pilgrim said at last. The gardener inclined its veiled head, and beneath the folds along its throat several hidden mouths smiled in sequence. "No," it replied with terrible gentleness. "You are trying to stop war from resembling itself. That is a smaller ambition." Then the paths around him began to fill. They emerged from behind flowering hedges, and from the silent pavilions, from orchards of script-barked trees, and from pools where alien stars turned beneath the surface. Some wore the forms of courtiers, draped in armor thin as silk and silk heavy as armor. Some resembled children crowned in laurel thorns. Some took on the shapes of old soldiers, noble women, priests, executioners, scholars, beloved sons, and forgotten mothers. Yet every face was slightly wrong, as a memory is wrong when grief has polished it too long. Their eyes were too luminous, or too dark. Their movements ended a fraction too late. Their mouths formed expressions not in response to feeling, but in anticipation of it. They came bearing dishes. The feast had been prepared before his arrival. Tables unfolded from the earth in curving rows of black wood and polished femur. Cloths spread across them of their own accord, white as burial wrappings. Candles rose from silver holders shaped like hands with missing fingers. Upon platters of obsidian and gold were arranged the delicacies of that realm, tongues preserved in amber gel, clusters of eyes nested in white petals, roasted birds whose breastbones were human collars fused with plumage, loaves that bled when torn, wine dark as coagulated prayer. At the center of the longest table stood a great covered vessel from which there escaped the scent of childhood kitchens, of festival bread, of forgiveness imagined but never granted. The courtiers took their places, and as they sat, each assumed a name, not their own, names stolen from mortal history. A queen rose and named herself after a martyr empress whose body had burned on 3 pyres at once. A pale child lifted a goblet and named itself after a general who had drowned worlds to deny them to rebellion. An eyeless scribe smiled from behind a mask of lilies and named itself after Lyra Vale's younger brother, dead before his beard had fully come in. Around the tables, names flowed like poison into water, every utterance an act of possession. Titles, epithets, lineages, beloved private diminutives, the secret names whispered by lovers, the battlefield names granted by comrades who did not survive to use them twice, all were taken up and worn. The pilgrim felt then what the city above was beginning to suffer. The garden did not conquer by claw or fang. It invaded the bond between suffering and identity. It learned what mortals called one another when they wished to make pain bearable. It clothed itself in those sounds. Where a thing can steal a name, it can often persuade the soul to follow. The gardener set down its basket upon the table. The hearts within beat louder. "You deny us purchase," it said. "We sought fear and found inconvenience. We sought pride and found absence. We sought guilt and found only a small impatience before avoidable misery. Such beings are rare. We would understand whether even a blank vessel may be taught appetite." The covered vessel at the center of the table was uncovered. Within lay not food, but faces. They were the faces of those he had seen on Ione since his coming, the dying sergeant by the wheel, the Hab children loading shells, the old woman who had thanked him for making the sky afraid, Lyra standing one-eyed amid the battlements, and countless others in layered sequence, arranged as if in sleep. Yet each face was unfinished at the edges, melting slowly into floral tissue. The feast had prepared itself from observation. It had learned what might matter to him, and failing that, had assembled the pattern of caring from the traces he left in action. The courtiers leaned forward. The candles burned lower, though no wax fell. "If you will not hunger," said the eyeless scribe wearing Lyra's brother's name, "then perhaps you will choose." With a slow motion, the gardener lifted one of the hearts from the basket. It pulsed warmly in its hand. "Each is attached," it said, "to a life above. To a soldier who still prays, to a widow who still waits, to a child who still believes tomorrow has shape. We need not devour them. We need only ask you which of them is necessary and which may be offered to preserve the rest." At this, the laughter ringing deeper in the garden fell silent. Even the hedges seemed to lean nearer. The stranger looked upon the heart, then at the feast, then into the surrounding faces that were not faces. He understood the snare, though perhaps not in all its refinements. It was the oldest cruelty dressed in cosmic silk. War forever demanded selection. Save this district, not that one. Spend these lives to preserve those, accept a smaller horror to avert the greater. All empires were made from such bargains, then called them tragic necessity until memory itself bowed before the phrase. "I am not choosing that," he said. A murmur passed along the tables like the brushing of many wings. The gardeners' hidden mouths opened wider beneath the veil. "Then all are chosen by refusing." He moved before the last word was complete. The table shattered beneath the force of his strike, obsidian plates and silver vessels vanishing into splinters and metallic dust. Courtiers exploded outward in sprays of petals, ash, and screaming names. The gardener tried to retreat, its veils unfurling into wings of stitched shadow, but his hand closed around its wrist with simple inevitability. The heart it held fell free. He seized the creature and drove it downward into the black soil. The garden convulsed. Across its ordered avenues, hedges burst open. Trees shed leaves of script that rose shrieking into the pearl-gray sky. Pools boiled with reflected battlefields collapsing into one another. From beneath the ground emerged roots braided with human vertebrae, lashing upward like whips. The feast had been an embassy and a test. His refusal transformed it into revelation. This realm, for all its elegance, could be struck. It could be wounded. But what could be wounded could also answer. The fallen gardener split apart in his grip, not into flesh, but into a cloud of black pollen that entered the air and spoke with 1,000 stolen voices at once. Every name taken at the table was released in reverse, not restored, but stripped, each syllable becoming a blade. Above Ione, in the city and trenches and burning sanctums, men and women stopped where they stood as memories failed behind their eyes. Some forgot their children, some forgot why they fought. Some forgot their gods. A few forgot their own faces and began to tear at them. And in the midst of the garden's agony, from the farthest pavilion where no path had led, there rose a shape seated upon a throne woven from roots and crown bones. It did not hurry. It did not need to. For when it turned its gaze upon the man who had refused the feast, the stranger felt, for the first time since entering that universe of ruin, that something had recognized not his strength, but his solitude, and found in it a door. The thing upon the throne of roots and crown bones did not rise. It had no need. Authority in that garden did not depend upon movement, for movement belonged to lesser hungers. It sat amid curtains of pale vine and drifting script leaves, robed in garments woven from the molted skins of names. Where its face should have been there shone only a smooth, dark oval, within which faint stars appeared and vanished as if trapped behind black ice. Around its throne the broken feast continued to ring with the after voices of stolen identities, a choir of all the beloved syllables by which mortals had once made one another bearable. The pilgrim stood among the wreckage, black pollen settling on his shoulders like ash. The enthroned presence regarded him, and in that regard there was neither fury nor admiration. There was curiosity sharpened by long appetite. It had seen war in all its forms. Glorious, abject, dutiful, ecstatic, inherited, imposed. It had watched kings become martyrs and martyrs become currencies. It had fed on the names men gave their dead so that grief might remain intelligible. Yet this plain-faced intruder had refused fear, refused worship, refused even the false nobility of tragic choice. He had struck the feast not because it offended his pride, but because it asked him to become like the world that had birthed it. The dark oval of its face brightened slightly. Then the garden opened. Not before him, but within the long corridor of his solitude. It found what all great predators of spirit seek, the hidden seam between strength and estrangement. A man who could not be bought by terror might yet be moved by isolation, by the endless repetition of intervention without belonging, by the suspicion that every world would twist help into doctrine and gratitude into chains. The garden did not speak these things aloud. It merely gave them shape. The paths, the pavilions, the orchards of script, all peeled aside like layers of painted silk. Beyond them there appeared another sky, hard and grey, ribbed with contrails and smoke. The scent of black soil gave way to cordite, engine oil, and brine blown inland from a polluted sea. He saw a city spread across a broken coast, its towers squat and defensive, its avenues lined not with shrines but with shattered civic colonnades and statues of lawmakers whose heads had been blasted off by orbital fire. Great banners hung between the ruins, not bearing the empire's sacred sigils, but a simpler emblem, an open hand beneath a broken crown. A voice came from the throne, though no mouth shaped it. There are worlds, it said, that do not ask to be saved. There are peoples who would rather die unnamed than live forever kneeling. Strike there. and you will learn whether peace survives the fall of power." Then the garden convulsed again, not from pain now, but from deliberate expulsion. The black soil split beneath the pilgrim. The enthroned presence receded into brightnessless distance. The realm of cultivated anguish folded inward, and he fell not downward, but elsewhere. He came into the world beneath a sky full of warcraft. The coastal city below him was called Halsa, though no calm had touched it in living memory. It stood upon the last free continent of a frontier planet abandoned by Imperial navigators generations before, then rediscovered when its mines and shipyards became strategically useful again. In the years since rediscovery, the Empire had come not as guardian but as collector, demanding tithe, conscription, creed, and obedience from a people whose ancestors had once fled those very burdens. Halsa was the final capital of their resistance, the last seat of what its defenders still called the Republic, though most of the institutions that had justified the name were rubble now. He struck the roof of a government archive and came through 3 floors in a storm of broken stone. Guards reached him first, thin-faced men and women in patched field armor bearing rifles of local make, not elegant but carefully maintained. They circled the crater in the archive hall with the caution of those too exhausted for heroics. None fired at once. The age had taught them suspicion, but also thrift. Ammunition was no longer spent on the unknown when the known was already at the gates. Then she arrived. General Malin Serrat of the last Republic wore no ceremonial greatness. Her coat was weatherproof naval cloth turned combat black by soot and rain. Her hair, once dark, had gone iron gray at the temples long before age demanded it. A burn scar crossed the side of her neck where an execution collar had once been fixed during an earlier capture from which she had escaped by means no court had fully reconstructed. She carried a sidearm but did not draw it. Her face bore that rare expression seen only in those who have accepted hope's unreliability without surrendering usefulness, not optimism, but resolution stripped of ornament. She looked into the crater where the pilgrim stood amid pulverized archives and drifting paper. "You are not ours," she said. "No," he answered. "Are you theirs?" He glanced upward through the torn roof at the warcraft moving across the gray sky. "I do not think so." That was enough for her, or at least enough for the next minute. Malin Serrat had led the Republic through 20 years of contraction, retreat, and sacrifice. She no longer possessed the luxury of seeking perfect certainty. She measured lives in hours bought, corridors held, ships launched, archives burned before capture. If a strange man fell from the sky in the hour before the city's probable death, then he would be judged first by the immediate arithmetic of use. "Come," she said. "If you are a weapon, you can decide later whom you belong to." She took him through the underways of Halsa, while the city groaned under bombardment. Along the route he saw what empire looked like when resisted without mythology. Not shrine processions, not saintly banners, not red-clothed ecstasies. There were food queues organized with military precision, children memorizing evacuation routes instead of hymns, old professors carrying ammunition crates, surgeons operating in former Senate chambers, while clerks read casualty ratios over the wounded so that no one could claim ignorance of cost. On walls scorched by, near strikes were written, the founding articles of the Republic in flaking paint: "No throne is sacred, no law above judgment, no citizen born to kneel." He read them in silence. Malin saw his eyes linger there. "They will seem small to you," she said as they descended another stair. "Most ideals do, after enough artillery." "I do not know," he replied. "They seem clear." That answer made her study him more closely than before. They emerged into the command vault beneath the old assembly hall, where maps glowed on cracked tables and air defense calculations crawled over the walls in green script. Officers turned as the general entered with the stranger at her side, and in their faces there flickered first alarm, then the brittle obedience by which doomed polities preserve their form. Malin heard the reports without sitting. Orbital guns had disabled the northern shield arrays. The eastern seawall batteries were firing their last reserve slugs. 3 divisions of Imperial infantry had breached the customs district. A demand for unconditional submission had been broadcast and ignored. The next broadcast, all agreed, would likely be extermination law. At length she dismissed the staff and remained alone with the pilgrim beside the map table. "You have done impossible things," she said, as though speaking a fact already verified beyond dispute. "Rumors travel farther than fleets. I have heard of the shrine world and the wound in the sky." He said nothing. "Then hear me plainly. I do not ask for salvation. Salvation is a word used by conquerors when they mean ownership. I ask whether you can break the fleet above this city before dawn." He looked at the green-lit map of Halsa, the shrinking defense perimeters, the red marks where civilians were still trapped in districts already written off by every practical measure. "If I do that," he said, "will the war end?" Malin Seret, last general of the last republic, closed her eyes for a brief moment that contained no prayer. "No," she said, "but this city may die as a people rather than survive as a possession." Outside the vault, the bombardment deepened. Dust drifted from the ceiling in pale threads. Somewhere above them, the assembly hall statues were falling one by one. The pilgrim stood over the map, and for the first time since entering that wounded galaxy, he faced not worship, nor horror, nor the seductions of cosmic malice, but a mortal demand stripped to its iron core. Not save us, but leave us ourselves. And because of that, he did not answer quickly. He did not answer quickly, because the question deserved the dignity of weight. Around the command vault of Halsa, the bombardment continued, a continuous descending argument from the heavens against the right of a people to remain themselves. Dust sifted through cracked seams in the ceiling. On the green-lit maps, districts of the city winked from amber to black as communication failed. General Malin Seret stood across from the plain-faced pilgrim with one hand resting on the table's edge, not in supplication but to steady the body that long campaigns had rendered more durable than whole governments. She had not asked for deliverance. She had asked for time enough that surrender would not become the only language left to her dead. At length he looked up from the shrinking lines of Halsa. "I can break the ships," he said, "but if more come, then it happens again." "Yes," she answered. "And if I destroy the empire for you, then something else takes its place." "Yes." He regarded her a moment longer, as if measuring not her courage but her refusal to disguise the shape of things. In that wounded galaxy he had seen fanatics call ruin salvation, and priests name bondage sacred so long as its chains were ancient. This woman did neither. She knew victory would not heal history. She wanted it anyway, because even a brief republic of the living was worth more than endless peace under a boot. "That still matters to you," he said. "It is the only reason not to become them." He inclined his head once. It was not assent in any ceremonial sense. It was simpler than that. Then the vault lurched as something vast struck the city above. Sirens rose in layered dissonance. One of the green maps burst into static. Officers rushed back through the blast curtains, shouting that the Western Assembly Dome had been hit by a lance from orbit and that a descent column was forming over the harbor approaches. Malin did not flinch. She began issuing commands before the first report had ended, shifting reserves that no longer existed, ordering demolitions that would bury her own government archives beneath defensive rubble, directing civilians toward undersea evacuation shafts, even though the transports below could carry only a fraction of them. The pilgrim listened for a few breaths, then asked where the fleet command vessel was. They took him to the roof of the old observatory. Halsa's highest tower had once charted tides and weather for merchant convoys in a gentler century. Now its dome was split open, its lenses cracked, its brass instruments repurposed into ranging arrays for the city's last anti-orbital batteries. From there, the whole capital could be seen beneath the grey sky, the harbor burning in long ribbons of fuel fire, the Senate quarter crushed into terraces of dust, the seawalls vomiting smoke, where heavy guns answered targets they could scarcely track. Beyond the bay hung the Imperial fleet, dark and immense, each vessel crowned with weapon spires and engine flares bright enough to stain the clouds. But there was another thing above them. The sky behind the fleet was not whole. It had acquired a second depth, as if the heavens reflected themselves through blackened glass. Within that deeper layer moved ghostly correspondences of the ships, larger, slower, not quite aligned with their material forms. Some burned where their real counterparts had not yet been struck. Some seemed already ruined. Others bore shapes no human navy had built. Ribbed leviathans, cathedral hulks drifting through impossible tides, and among them fields of dim red stars arranged in patterns too deliberate for nature. The bombardment lances descending on Halsa appeared first in that mirrored depth, then a heartbeat later in the visible world. Malin watched the distortion with the stillness of long despair receiving a new name. Their navigators are using the deep medium as a lens, she said. They are firing through a reflection. The Republic's scholars had called it many things over the generations. The undertide, the second sea, the pressure realm beneath thought. The Empire named it according to its own theology and chained the gifted to look into it. Whatever the language, the truth remained the same. Human conflict, once amassed on a sufficient scale, disturbed that hidden vastness. Halsa, Ione, 1,000 other wars, all had cast themselves downward into it. Now the fleet above was not merely besieging the city. It was reading the reflection made by fear, sacrifice, and stubborn memory, then correcting its fire by the shape of souls in extremity. The pilgrim looked at the doubled ships and frowned slightly, not in awe but in irritation, as one might regard an unnecessarily complicated machine. Below, a column of Imperial drop craft entered the atmosphere over the harbor district. Anti-air bursts climbed to meet them and failed. Malin lifted her field glass, saw the insignia on the descending craft, and lowered it again. "The executioners," she said. "Gold armor. They have come for someone important." He did not need telling. Far away on Ione, the 7 of the Gilded Sepulchre were even now descending into streets of red-clothed processions and flowering nightmares, carrying the Empire's final courtesy in their hands. The wars of this age were never separate. They touched each other through doctrine, through the deep medium, through the appetite of powers that fed on recurrence. A city under siege on a frontier world and a shrine world under a dying sun could become, in the unseen reflection, adjacent wounds. He stepped to the observatory's broken rim. "Can they see me if I go up there?" he asked. Malin understood at once which sky he meant. "Yes," she said, "but not only them." He looked once at the fleet, once at the blackened city beneath, and once at the second depth hanging behind it all like a wound, remembering how it had been made. Then he bent his knees and rose. The tower burst apart beneath the force of his ascent. Brass instruments spun into the wind. Stone peeled from the observatory like bark from a struck tree. He passed through the gun smoke, through the descending craft, through the first layer of cloud, and entered the contested heavens between the fleet and its reflection. There, the war became stranger. The nearer he came to the mirrored depth, the less stable direction remained. Ships were above and below him at once, their material hulls crossing the ghost forms of their deeper selves. Lances moved like thoughts. Explosions occurred in silence first, then gained sound as reality decided to accept them. He struck the nearest capital vessel with one downward blow, and its armored spine broke cleanly, halves tumbling apart in fire. Yet in the reflected depth behind it, the ship remained whole for several breaths, turning slowly to regard him with rows of lit windows like patient eyes. Then the reflection answered. From the dark mirror of the warp there came not a fleet, but a single figure moving toward him through impossible distance. It bore his outline exactly. Plain mantle, bare head, ordinary human proportions. Yet within its silhouette stars burned where organs should have been, and upon its face there rested the expression this universe had tried so ceaselessly to carve into him, the expression of a man who had finally agreed that peace could only be bought by deciding, without pity, who deserved to remain in it. It lifted one hand, and all across the mirrored heavens the ghost ships began to turn in unison. Below, Halsa burned beneath 2 skies. Above, the man who wished to end war found war returning his shape to him, sharpened by every compromise he had refused. The reflected figure approached through the blackened depth behind the sky, and every law by which distance had once consoled mankind failed around it. It did not hasten, yet it drew near. It did not blaze, yet all lesser lights withdrew from its path. The mirrored warships of the deep medium turned with it, their ghost hulls adjusting to its silence as though it were a gravity more ancient than stars. Below, the real fleet continued its bombardment of Halsa, but now each falling lance seemed less a weapon than an echo, a secondary event cast by some deeper and more decisive violence taking shape beyond visible heaven. The plain-faced pilgrim hung amid debris, fire, and broken metal. Around him drifted fragments of the capital vessel he had sundered, their molten edges cooling in air that no longer knew whether it belonged to atmosphere or void. He looked upon the figure that wore his form and saw at once that resemblance was not the deepest horror. The true obscenity lay in the expression it bore, not rage, not sorrow, not ecstasy, but a grave and terrible resolve. It was the face of strength that had accepted judgment as its final purpose. The reflection spoke without opening its mouth. Its words were heard first in the ghost fleet behind it, where whole ships trembled and brightened as though language had passed through their metal bones. Then the same words entered the ears of living men below, though no vox carried them. In the command vaults of Halsa, in the underways where refugees waited beneath concrete and prayerless civic oaths, in the burning sanctums of Ione where the red saints held crimson candles against flowering walls, the message came alike. You strike against symptoms and call it mercy. As it spoke, the mirrored depth widened. Halsa's sky became a wound with two lips, one of cloud and smoke, the other of impossible night. Through that cleft appeared visions not offered in sequence, but in burden. Worlds starved in the name of order, worlds flayed in the name of freedom, thrones built from bones and republics paved over mass graves. Holy wars. Liberation wars. Wars of memory, wars of inheritance, wars begun for doctrine, for fuel, for insult, for fear of being forgotten. All of them flowed together beneath the speaking wound until they resembled not separate catastrophes, but one continuous argument prosecuted through different centuries. On Ione, in the buried machine vaults beneath Valturris, the awakened engines heard the same voice and answered with screams in extinct machine dialects. Their bronze casings split. Coolant flooded the floors. Archdominus Serac watched sacred mechanisms convulse as data impossible to contain forced itself through systems built for stars and calendars, not revelation. Inquisitor Malrek Voss, standing amid incense and shorting wires, understood with a cold clarity that what spoke now was not merely a creature of the warp, nor even a god in the coarse sense men used that word. It was a principle fed by recurrence. It was war learning to narrate itself. Above Halsa, the reflection raised one hand. The ghost ships fired. No beams crossed the space between them and the pilgrim. Instead, the very pressure of choices long deferred descended upon him. Around his body appeared moments not yet lived, but ready to be chosen into existence. A city saved by crushing another beneath its falling shield. A republic preserved by executing its dissenters before siege could break it from within. Ione spared from the garden's bloom by culling every soul who had looked upon the breach and thus carried its spores in memory. The corpse thrones of empire toppled, only for a cleaner, colder dominion to rise over their ashes with his strength as its founding law. Each vision bore the same shape beneath its differences, peace purchased by selection, innocence abandoned as an administrative luxury. The reflection spoke again. If you would end war, become its final judge. Then it struck. Its blow did not come from a fist alone, but from alignment. The mirrored fleets, the falling lances, the memories of slaughter embedded in both worlds, all converged upon the man as one intention. For the first time since he had entered that dying galaxy, he was driven backward. Not far, not helplessly, but enough that Halsa below saw a line of fire carve across the sky where his body passed. The observatory ruin shook, windows burst for miles. General Malin Serat, standing among the last gunners on the assembly roof, felt something in her chest tighten, not hope failing, for she had not trusted hope. but the recognition that even impossible strength could be made to answer questions it had never consented to bear. The pilgrim recovered in the upper air and looked down. That glance saved Halsa. A barrage of real lances, timed beneath the Reflection's assault, had been descending toward the evacuation shafts along the harbor. Hundreds of thousands had been driven there in desperate order, civilians and soldiers alike funneling toward the undersea tunnels from which perhaps a remnant might survive. He saw the lights, the columns, the human concentration at the instant before impact. He moved, and the sky broke after him. One by one, then in clusters, then in continuous sequence, he met the descending fire with his hands. He struck beams aside. He shattered lance columns into harmless auroras that spilled over the bay in sheets of blue-white ruin. He tore through drop craft and flung them back toward the fleet. He moved so swiftly that for a moment the people below believed the heavens full of many such figures, not one. The harbor survived, the sea walls survived. The crowd in the tunnels continued downward into dark water and uncertain futurity. But each act of protection strengthened the speaking wound, because each choice made him choose again. The Reflection did not pursue immediately. It watched him save what he could, and in its stillness there was a patience beyond malice. It knew what the universe already knew. No strength, however absolute in combat, could be everywhere. To save one place was to leave another to mathematics. The trap was not defeat, the trap was stewardship. Far away, on Ione, the wound above Val Turris opened its voice fully at last. It spoke not in sentences, but in intimate addresses. To the Red Saints it promised a world where no priest would ever again stand between grief and meaning. To the besiegers it promised a cosmos where agony was no longer squandered in anonymity, but harvested into power. To Illyria Vale it whispered that the city could still be preserved if she sealed its gates forever and burned the infected districts alive. To Malrek Voss it offered the one certainty his vocation had always secretly craved, a criterion by which every soul might be judged without ambiguity. To the old machines beneath the shrine world it murmured names from before mankind's rise, and several went mad with remembrance. And to the plain-faced pilgrim, suspended between fleet and Reflection above Halsa, it said only this: "You do not hate enough to finish what you begin." The words entered no ear but his, yet they carried farther than thunder. For a long moment he did not move. Below him burned the Republic, far away endured the shrine world. Around him turned the fleets of empire and their deeper shadows. Before him waited the Reflection that offered judgment as mercy's final form. Then, slowly, the wound in the sky began to open where a mouth should not exist, as though the universe itself were preparing to tell him what it believed a savior must become. The mouth in the wound opened across two worlds at once. Above Halsa, the mirrored heavens peeled apart like old lacquer beneath a blade. Above Ione, the pale rupture over the siege plain widened until the dying red sun seemed caught within its torn edges like an ember lodged in torn flesh. Across both skies there descended not fire nor darkness, but direction. Every ship in the Imperial fleet, every astropathic choir still conscious, every shrine bell and machine engine and nerve of fear in mortal bodies bent toward a single unreachable center, as filings bend to the nearness of a hidden magnet. The wound had spoken enough. Now it pointed. The reflected figure before the pilgrim lifted its hand once more, not in threat but in invitation. Around it, the ghost fleet turned inward and dissolved into luminous strands, each strand a line of war, sacrifice, command, obedience, plague, devotion, and annihilation stretched across centuries and drawn now toward one place, beyond ordinary distance. He understood then, not by doctrine but by the same blunt instinct with which he had crossed battlefields and broken engines, that the voice behind the wound was not merely tempting him with judgment. It was showing him the hinge upon which this age of torment swung. Below, Halsa still burned. General Malin Serrat stood among the last guns on the assembly roof, her coat snapping in the furnace wind, watching the sky become a map of converging grief. The harbor tunnels were filling with refugees. The fleet still possessed guns enough to end the city before dawn. Yet for a brief moment the bombardment faltered, as if the Empire itself had turned to listen upward. She saw the plain-faced man suspended amid the wreckage of ships and reflected stars. Though vast distance lay between them, something in his stillness changed, and she knew with a soldier's unwelcome clarity that he had found not a way to save the city, but a question larger than it. On Ione, Canoness Elira Vale saw the same alteration from the battlements of Val Turis. Around her the Red Saints marched in crimson processions through streets overgrown with impossible bloom. Beyond the walls, the enemy chanted before the open breach in reality, while beneath the city the ancient machines screamed their dead names into coolant and static, all of it bent toward that one unseen center. The city's war, Halsa's war, the Empire's war, the garden's harvest, even the words spoken by the wound, each had become a tributary to a deeper river. The pilgrim moved. He did not rise through the fleet in violence this time, he passed through it. Warships shuddered aside as though some hidden current had claimed him. Their guns did not track. Their crews dropped to their knees or went blind at their stations. The reflected figure watched him go and made no effort to bar the path. It had served its function. It had shown him the shape he would assume if he agreed that power must end in adjudication. Now it let him proceed toward the source against which all such judgments had been rehearsals. The journey was not through space alone. He crossed stratums of empire laid one upon another like sedimentary guilt. He passed cathedrals anchored to void stations where choirs of children without eyelids sang fuel calculations into furnaces. He passed libraries in which entire planets had been reduced to legal categories stamped upon bone tablets. He passed prison moons whose lights flickered in precise penitential rhythms. He passed battlefields preserved in vacuum as examples to future generations, every corpse left where it had fallen so doctrine could walk among them and explain necessity. Fleets, worlds, laws, relics, famines, coronations, exterminations, everything pointed inward. At last, the center revealed itself. It was not a world but a throne system, hidden within storms of debris and prayer-saturated void, veiled by such density of defense, sanctity, and taboo that ordinary navigation could never have found it. Vast rings of weapon platforms encircled it. Processional fleets moved in preordained orbits like beads on a rosary too large for comprehension. At the heart of it all stood a structure built from mountain-sized bastions, vaults, towers, chapels, crypts, and engine masses fused over 10,000 years into one impossible architecture. A palace not for dwelling, but for sustaining a single unending act of rule. He entered by force of arrival alone. Alarms spread in silence first, then in cascading sirens across 1,000 sanctified corridors. Gold-armored executioners turned in unison. Blind astropaths convulsed in their thrones. Inquisitors and chamber priests looked up from censers, ledgers, and sacrificial engines as every lumen dimmed, then steadied. He crossed halls lined with giants entombed upright in armor. He crossed courtyards where pilgrims crawled on bleeding knees around reactors disguised as altars. He crossed chambers where 1,000,000 candles burned before the machinery of one immortal suffering. No one stopped him. Some could not. Some did not dare. Some, in the secret chambers of their exhausted hearts, may have wished to see what even the Empire had ceased believing possible. Then he came at last into the final sanctum. The chamber was larger than many cities. Darkness hung above it in layers like ancient smoke. Cables descended from heights unseen, thick as towers, entering a great apparatus of iron, gold, and black stone raised upon ascending terraces of ash-colored steps. Upon that apparatus sat the sovereign center of the empire, not a king in any human sense, but a being reduced and exalted into function, a dying will bound into engines, prayer, law, and pain so that a species' dominion might continue for one day more. The pilgrim looked upon the throne of ash and iron and understood why the wound had brought him here. Everything radiating through the galaxy of man issued from this place: command, faith, terror, endurance, sacrifice without measure, obedience converted into cosmology. This was the heart of the age's agony. Strike here, and perhaps the whole diseased edifice would finally fail. He stepped forward. Then the chamber answered, not with soldiers, nor guns, nor the wound's seductive voice, but with absence. Across the far reaches beyond the throne he saw, for one vertiginous instant, what the machinery had been holding back. The dark beyond mankind's empire was not empty. It pressed inward on every side, vast intelligences, devouring tides, ancient hungers, whole nights of existence that would pour through the moment this throne ceased its labor. The tyranny before him was a prison and a barricade both. It was atrocity harnessed as bulwark. Its cruelty had become load-bearing. The hand he had begun to close into a fist did not fall. Around the throne, the engines deepened their thunder. Somewhere within the immortal apparatus, something that had once been a man opened one ruined eye. And in that eye there was no plea for mercy, only the exhausted knowledge that if the blow came now, the galaxy would indeed be freed of one horror by surrendering itself to all the others. For a long moment in the throne sanctum, nothing moved but the labor of the machines. The vast apparatus of rule continued its thunder around the seated sovereign, pistons exhaling incense and heat, cables trembling with impossible burdens, choir engines murmuring equations of pain into the dark. Before it stood the plain-faced pilgrim, his hand half closed, his strength sufficient to ruin what empires had hidden behind 10,000 years of reverence. Beyond it all waited the dark pressure he had glimpsed, the innumerable hungers massed outside the walls of human dominion, held at bay not by goodness, but by endurance weaponized into tyranny. To strike the throne was to free the galaxy from one torment by surrendering it to all the others. To turn away was to accept the continuance of the same charnel order that had made entire civilizations into fuel for its own postponement. In that chamber, where men had long mistaken impossible choices for sacred wisdom, he saw the shape of the trap entire. Every path offered to him ended in agreement with the age. Judge or submit. Destroy or preserve. Choose which agony should govern the rest. He had refused that bargain in the garden. He refused it now. His gaze lifted from the throne itself to the immense vault above, where darkness hung in strata thick with prayer residue, smoke, and the invisible architecture of transmission. There, braided through the chamber and outward through the palace, the system, the fleets, the worlds, ran the channels by which one being's sustained torment had become the Empire's pulse. Faith, command, navigation, sanction, warning, fear, all of it passed through these unseen arteries. The throne was not merely a seat, it was a wound made into a signal. He drew back his hand, not against the sovereign on the throne, not against the withered eye that had opened in exhausted witness. He struck upward, into the heart of the machinery by which suffering was spoken across the stars. The blow did not shatter stone first. It shuddered through meanings. Across the sanctum, every cable went rigid. Choir engines burst their bronze casings and fell silent. The black vault overhead split with lines of white absence, as if the air itself had forgotten how to contain transmission. The ascending terraces cracked, sigils failed in sequence. The throne's great mechanisms screamed once with a sound too deep for mortal ears and then ceased as a body ceases when the heart mislays its rhythm. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It crossed worlds. On Eon, the bells of Valturis stopped in the act of ringing. Their tongues froze against bronze. The red saints halted mid-procession, crimson candles guttering in their hands. In the trenches before the city, men raising rifles found they could no longer hear their own breath. The pale wound above the battlefield quivered. Its flowering light dimmed. The impossible vines spreading through sanctum, alley, and ossuary bowed their heads as though a frost had entered paradise. In the buried vaults beneath the shrine world, the ancient machines that had remembered God fell mute all at once, their speaker grills darkening, their last static prayers severed before completion. On Halsa, the Imperial fleet drifting above the burning coast lost its cadence. Gunnery lances failed in their housings. Orders died unborn in vox chapels. Navigators screamed as the reflected sky behind the world vanished, not closed, but withdrawn so completely that the void appeared naked and depthless in its absence. General Malin Serat stood upon the assembly roof and watched the bombardment cease between one breath and the next, as if war itself had forgotten the next line of its liturgy. Across the empire, astropaths went blind into stillness. Some died smiling, for the pressure that had lain upon their skulls since childhood lifted so suddenly that they mistook release for death and death for release. On prison moons, execution squads lowered their rifles without knowing why. In forge cathedrals, machine priests looked up from glowing altars as the sacred hum in their implants went out, leaving only the small mechanical tick of earthly devices. In ship crypts, coffin chambers housing ancient heroes ceased their whispering. In chapels, congregations stared at unresponsive icons and understood for one unendurable instant that the constant noise of heaven had not been heaven at all, but a labor. Even beyond mankind's realms, other things noticed. The garden beyond the veil folded its blossoms. The feast tables rotted in a single breath. The enthroned power of names unmade leaned forward in the dimness of its pavilion, deprived of the river of war cries and supplications by which it had irrigated its orchards. In gulfs farther out than language, predatory immensities turned, sensing a lapse in the human signal upon which they had long triangulated. And into that lapse there entered something stranger than terror. Stillness, not peace. The galaxy was too blood-soaked for peace to arise from interruption alone. It was instead a suspension so complete that each being, from emperor to conscript, from martyr to heretic, from engine to orphan, stood for a single immeasurable interval outside the habitual roar by which existence had been explained to them. There was no command, no prayer answer, no psychic weather, no righteous sanction murmuring behind cruelty, no reflected voice telling the strong whom to judge and the weak how to suffer nobly. Men heard the scrape of their own thoughts. Many could not endure it. On Ione, some of the Red Saints began to weep, not from ecstasy, but because without the bells, the chants, and the pressure of revelation, they suddenly saw only a ruined city full of hungry people wrapped in red cloth. In the enemy trenches, veterans who had offered whole lives to sacred hatred looked across the scarred plain and recognized their foes not as doctrine, but as other exhausted bodies beneath the same failing sun. Several lowered their standards into the mud and did not raise them again. Others, deprived of the voices that had instructed their rage, started screaming for them to return. In the throne sanctum, the immortal sovereign's one open eye remained fixed on the pilgrim. Around them, the vast apparatus stood lifeless. The hand he had raised had not destroyed the throne, but for the first time in ages it had interrupted its speech. Between ruler and intruder there stretched a silence older than empire, and within it lay a terrible kinship. Both had refused, in different ways and for different ages, to let the world become wholly devoured by what waited beyond. Then the dark outside answered. At the far edges of the sanctum, beyond the halted engines and beneath the cracked vault, a pressure began to gather, not the old familiar pressure of sanctioned torment, but the raw approach of all that had been held back. The stillness had created a gap. The gap was being noticed. Far away on Halsa, the fleet drifted weaponless for a blessed instant while civilians poured through the undersea tunnels. Malin Serat saw the ships hanging inert against the grey sky and understood that history had opened a narrow door no mortal plan had earned. Yet she also saw, in the same heavens, new lights beginning to form where no vessel should have been, as if other powers had detected the lapse and were coming to inspect the wound. On Ione, the pale breach over the battlefield did not close. It shrank, trembled, and became for one breath no larger than a human pupil. Within that pupil something looked out, and in the great silence between heartbeats, before the universe remembered how to scream again, the pilgrim understood at last that he had not stopped the war. He had merely made everything hear what remained when war fell quiet. The silence did not last. Nothing made by men could have preserved it, for men had built themselves too long against its possibility. The halt that spread from the broken throne sanctum through fleet, shrine world, trench, tunnel, chapel, forge and prison had revealed too much too quickly. It had torn away the constant weather of command and liturgy by which the age justified its own continuance. Beneath that stripping, some had found horror, some relief, some a glimpse of the wasted simplicity for which whole species might have bartered their future. But no revelation remains pure once it enters a hungry world. The first sound to return was not a gun. It was weeping. On Ione, beneath the dimming red sun and the shrinking pupil of the wound overhead, the red saints stood in their crimson cloth among the ruined avenues of Valturis and began to weep, as if waking from one collective dream into another, harsher and more intimate. Their bells hung mute. Their chants had abandoned them. Around them lay a city no miracle had repaired, children still hungry, walls still broken, hospitals still filled with the half-dying and the almost dying. Some tore the red bands from their arms in shame. Some kissed them and tied them tighter, refusing to let the silence annul what they had seen. In the lower sanctum districts, old priests emerged from cellars and declared that the muteness of heaven was the greatest test yet sent to mankind. In the burned East Quarter, others declared that heaven had finally withdrawn from all hierarchies and left men to sanctify one another or perish unblessed. Thus faith resumed, not as certainty but as competition. Outside the walls, the besieging armies also broke differently. Many had lived so long within the cadence of holy hatred that when the voices ceased, they discovered beneath them only fatigue and the mud-bound fact of their own bodies. Some dropped to their knees and could not be made to stand again. Some crossed the scar of the mercy road toward the city without weapons, as if compelled not by peace, but by the need to see whether their enemies possessed faces. Others, finding the wound in the sky reduced to a watching point of pale light and hearing no answer from the powers to whom they had offered their dead, became afraid in a purer and more dangerous way than before. Bereft of cosmic instruction, they clung harder to the only logic remaining, that if meaning would not descend from beyond, it must be beaten out of the nearest vulnerable thing. At dusk, fighting resumed along the southern trenches between men who had, an hour earlier, nearly embraced. No prophet ordered it. No high command restored it. A sentry fired because movement in the haze resembled a raid. Another answered because he had lost 2 brothers to raids and had sworn never again to hesitate. A squad charged because they believed the silence was a trap. Mortars answered because any pause in war looked, to seasoned officers, like the preparation for worse war. The line flared. New dead fell into mud, still warm from revelation. On Halsa, the same law returned in another guise. The fleet above the city hung crippled and confused for long minutes after the throne's speech was broken. Orders had vanished between mouths and machines. Gunnery crews stared at dead targeting arrays. Pilots drifted in the stormlight with no blessed route open through the deeper medium. In the undersea tunnels, refugees moved in disciplined columns toward the dark water lifts while the city held its breath around them. General Malin Serrat saw the window and widened it with every remaining resource, detonating harbor bridges behind the evacuation streams, jamming ascent lanes with burning hulks, sacrificing the northern batteries to buy the southern shafts another quarter hour. For a time it worked. Then hunger resumed its office. Some captains in the fleet, isolated from central command and terrified of what the lapse in cosmic sanction might mean, interpreted silence as permission to become sovereign within their own radius of fire. One ordered extermination of the harbor approaches to prevent the escape of rebels who might one day return. Another refused, not from mercy, but because live populations were taxable and the empire's debt to itself never died. 2 escort squadrons exchanged fire over contradictory readings of duty. On the ground, Republican units who had fought for liberty through 3 generations began shooting deserters at the tunnel mouths because panic in the lines would doom the many to save the trembling few. A warehouse of rations was stormed by civilians who had obeyed every evacuation order until the sight of armed guards standing between them and food broke obedience into teeth and fists. Malin Serrat moved through these fractures as through old weather. She did not curse mankind for failing the silence. She had never believed revelation abolished appetite. She knew republics also fed on discipline, and discipline became cruelty the instant it feared dissolution. Yet somewhere behind her iron composure there passed a grief too lean to name. The pause had shown what might exist if no one were constantly being told whom to fear. Now each person, deprived of the grand machinery of hatred, had gone to retrieve smaller hatreds from within themselves. High above both worlds, in the throne sanctum where the great apparatus still stood mute and cracking, the plain-faced pilgrim looked upon the consequence and understood the wound's oldest lie. It had offered him judgeship because judgeship was the shape war most desired in those strong enough to oppose it. It wished him to believe that conflict lived chiefly in thrones, fleets, cults, and abyssal mouths, because such enemies could be struck. But the deeper fortress was distributed. It lived in inheritance, in scarcity, in memory sharpened by burial, in the human need to make pain lawful by giving it a banner, a scripture, or a mathematics. He could break engines. He could silence heavens. He could tear through the machinery that converted torment into empire. Yet even in the first true stillness this age had known, men had reached into themselves and found enough embers to relight the pyre. The one ruined eye upon the throne remained open. No word passed between the seated sovereign and the standing intruder. None was needed. Both saw, from opposite ends of unbearable endurance, that the war had roots too fine and numerous for any fist to seize entire. Outside the sanctum, the dark pressures held back by the throne system continued to gather, testing the edges of the silence, seeking the first reopened seam. Already in far systems, cults were proclaiming the muteness of heaven as either apocalypse or liberation. Already generals were claiming emergency powers no law had granted. Already martyrs were being invented for battles that had only just resumed. On Ione, Canoness Elira Vale stood upon Maiden's Rest, as the southern trenches burned again and the pale pupil in the sky watched without blinking. Below her, the Red Saints had divided into factions. One marched toward the gates, bearing bandages and food for anyone who would cease fighting long enough to take them. Another armed itself in the lower crypts, declaring that the silence had proved all institutions false and only direct force sacred. Both claimed the stranger as their sign. On Halsa, Malin received word that the first refugee columns had reached the sea lifts, and that the fleet, though disordered, was reforming under captains too frightened to remain uncertain. She gave the order to abandon the assembly quarter and fall back to the last inner line. Her officers obeyed, though each knew there might be no line after that. And in the throne sanctum, as the first tremor of returning psychic thunder passed through the dead machinery like a heartbeat trying to remember itself, the pilgrim raised his head. From far beyond the palace walls, beyond fleet and throne and world, there came again the faint laughter of the garden beyond the veil, patient now, as if it had no need to triumph so long as men continued planting it for free. The laughter came thinly at first, as if from beyond many curtains. It moved through the dead machinery of the throne sanctum, through cracked conduits and silent choir engines, through the ash hanging in the air where once prayer and command had flowed like blood through an artery. It was the laughter of the garden beyond the veil, but diminished now, not because its appetite had waned, but because the brief silence between heartbeats had taught it patience. It no longer needed to seduce multitudes with bloom and fragrance. Men, once returned to themselves, resumed the labor of cultivation. The plain-faced pilgrim stood before the throne of ash and iron and listened. Around him the vast sanctum trembled with the first returning pulses of the age. The halted mechanisms shuddered. Cables hanging like black roots began to twitch as power sought them again. Far beyond the palace walls, fleets were reassembling their formations, priesthoods their explanations, generals their permissions. On Ione the trenches burned once more. On Halsa the fleet closed its wounded ranks above the sea. Everywhere the pause was being translated into doctrine. Some called it the admonishing silence. Some named it the betrayal of heaven. Some swore it proved the empire must tighten its hand. Others that all thrones were lies and should be drowned in their own sanctified blood. Revelation had become material, and history was already forging bullets from it. The one ruined eye upon the throne remained open. No command came from it, no accusation, only that exhausted witness which had endured so long it had become part of the architecture of necessity. The pilgrim looked back into that eye and understood, without liking, that the sovereign before him had become the purest emblem of the universe he had entered, a being so long sacrificed to holding worse darkness back that its own monstrousness had come to seem indispensable. He had not struck it. That restraint now spread outward through millions of consequences. If he destroyed the throne now, the dark beyond would flood inward while the empire reeled in muteness. Worlds would vanish before new orders could invent themselves. If he restored it wholly, then the old agony would harden again, justified by the memory of interruption. If he remained to guard the center, then he would become exactly what the speaking wound had offered him: final judge, irreplaceable force. The fist enthroned above history because history had proven too diseased to trust with itself. He turned away. That was the act by which the age would remember him most falsely. He did not turn away from suffering. He turned away from centrality. Yet, in an empire that mistook dominion for responsibility, any refusal to rule looked like abandonment. He crossed the sanctum in long, ordinary steps while behind him the throne's engines sought their staggered rhythm. Golden executioners entered the outer galleries and halted at the sight of him, not daring to advance. Priests fell prostrate. Astropaths bled from sealed eyes. Somewhere in the palace a great bell began to ring again, uncertainly at first, then with mounting force as the systems of command rediscovered each other. He passed them all. The outer terraces of the palace opened before him into the void, vast balconies from which embassies, triumphal decrees, and funeral smoke had been sent across the stars. He looked outward and saw the empire spread in layers: orbital fortresses, reliquary fleets, processional barges, patrol rings, debris fields thick with the discarded armor of 10 millennia. Beyond all that lay the dark, pressing at the edges, patient, swollen with interest. He left the palace in a single leap. The void broke around him in silence. He crossed fleets that tracked him too slowly, defense lattices that flared and failed, station halos whose guns never completed their firing rites before he had passed them. He did not head first for Halsa or Ione, though both worlds still burned within his knowing. He moved between them, outward and downward through the war-clotted night, as if seeking a place from which the whole diseased map might be seen without becoming its ruler. On Halsa, General Malin Serat received word that the bombardment had resumed, though in ragged and conflicting patterns. Some Imperial captains fired upon the city. Others fired upon their own ships to enforce old chains of command. Others withdrew entirely, claiming supernatural contamination in the siege theater. The harbor still burned, but the undersea lifts had taken tens of thousands beyond immediate death. It was not victory. It was continuation purchased in fragments. Malin stood in the shattered interior line with seawater dripping from the tunnel exits behind her and gave the order to keep moving civilians south. When an officer told her the Skyman had vanished from the throne world without seizing power, she closed her eyes only briefly. "Good," she said, though whether in relief or bitterness even she could not have said. On Ione, Canoness Illyra Vale watched the pale pupil over the battlefield dilate once, then collapse into a line so thin it resembled a scar drawn upon the heavens. The flowering growths receded from some districts and deepened in others. The Red Saints split openly into warring creeds. One carried bread and bandages across the lines under white flags stained pink with old blood. Another nailed red cloth to rifles and declared the age of mediation over. The besiegers did not withdraw. The city did not submit. Yet in the southern trenches, where fighting had resumed at dusk, there came now and then brief cessations in which enemies exchanged water without speaking. These pauses never lasted. They were not strong enough. But they existed, and that alone made them dangerous to every hierarchy that fed on permanence. Above both worlds, rumor outran fleet and prayer alike. Some said the Wanderer had struck heaven and found it hollow. Some said he had knelt before the corpse throne and been crowned with invisible fire. Some said he had fled when shown the true weight of rule. Some said he was no savior at all, only a symptom of the age's nearing end. Children drew him on cellar walls as a plain man standing beneath stars that looked afraid. Priests painted over the drawings by day and repainted them correctly by night. Generals cursed his name when ceasefires flickered where bombardment should have sufficed. Cults adored him for not choosing them. Empires hated him for the same reason. And he moved through the galaxy, never staying long enough for institutions to close their hands around him. Where artillery had pinned whole populations in ritual slaughter, he broke guns and vanished before banners could gather. Where worlds were being fed into doctrinal engines, he tore the engines apart and left the priests alive to face the people they had named fuel. Where rebel kings sought to use his coming as proof that their own dominion would be gentler, he struck their thrones first. Yet nothing ended. Each intervention halted one massacre and displaced 3 others. Each shattered hierarchy released buried appetites below it. Again and again he met the same truth wearing new armor. The stars were full not merely of tyrants, but of inheritances. Years later, in records disputed by every surviving power, there appears an account of him standing alone upon an unnamed moon made of black glass, looking out over a civil war so vast that both sides used suns as calendar markers. He did not descend at once. He watched the fleets burn in slow procession and the continents brighten under orbital fire. At his feet lay a stone inscribed in a language older than man. No scholar has translated it with certainty, but the most faithful rendering reads thus: "Strength can stop the hand. It cannot teach the heart to open." Whether he read those words or merely stood above them, no chronicler can say. The account ends with him raising his eyes to the war below, not in triumph nor in despair, but in the grave weariness of one who had learned that to save the stars was impossible, and to leave them wholly to themselves was worse. Then he stepped forward, descending once more into the fire, while far beyond him in the dark between galaxies, powers, ancient and unborn alike, turned to watch the man who could not save the stars and who had not yet stopped trying.